Marcus Thompson finally reached the spot where Guardsman James Mitchell stood at perfect attention. The distance between them was now less than 3 feet. Marcus could see every detail of the guard's uniform, from the shiny brass buttons to the perfectly straight seam running down the red jacket. He could even see his own angry reflection in the polished surface of James' boots. Without warning, Marcus began to shout. His voice cut through the morning air like a knife, startling tourists who had been peacefully taking photographs just moments before. The words that poured from his mouth were filled with rage and political demands. He screamed about government corruption, about the waste of taxpayer money, and about how the royal family did not care about ordinary citizens. James Mitchell did not move a single muscle. His eyes remained fixed on that invisible point in the distance. His face showed no emotion at all, as if Marcus was not even there. This complete lack of response only made Marcus angrier than he already was. He had expected some kind of reaction, even just a quick glance, but got absolutely nothing. The tourists around them stopped their conversations and turned to watch what was happening. Children who had been laughing and playing just minutes before now stood quietly behind their parents. Some people began taking out their phones, sensing that something dramatic was about to unfold. Others felt uncomfortable and started moving away to find safer viewing spots. Marcus stepped even closer to James until their faces were almost touching. He could feel the heat radiating from his own flushed cheeks. Sweat was beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His breathing had become so heavy that James could probably feel it, even though the guard gave no sign that he noticed. The flagpole in Marcus' hands began to move more aggressively. What had started as nervous swaying now became deliberate jabbing motions directed toward the guard. Marcus waved the heavy wooden pole back and forth just inches from James' face. The banner attached to the top fluttered wildly, creating a snapping sound that added to the tension of the moment. Still, James did not react. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. Royal guards were taught to remain calm and motionless, no matter what happened around them. They had to deal with drunk tourists, rude visitors, and occasionally people with mental health problems. But James had never faced someone quite as angry and aggressive as Marcus. The crowd that had gathered to watch the ceremony now found themselves witnessing something entirely different. What should have been a peaceful cultural experience was turning into a confrontation that made everyone nervous. Parents pulled their children closer while elderly visitors looked around for security officers. Marcus began to circle around James like a predator studying its prey. He walked slowly from the guard's left side to his right side and then back again, all while continuing to shout his political messages. The flagpole never left his hands, and he used it to point at James as he spoke, emphasizing his angry words with aggressive gestures. A young couple from Canada, who had been standing nearby, decided they had seen enough. They quietly gathered their belongings and moved to a different area near the palace gates. Other tourists followed their example, creating a growing circle of empty space around Marcus and James. Only the bravest or most curious visitors remained close enough to see what would happen next. Security personnel who had been monitoring the situation from a distance began moving closer. They walked casually, trying not to draw attention to themselves, but their trained eyes never left Marcus. Radio messages were being passed between different security teams as they coordinated their response to the developing situation. The morning sun continued to shine down on the scene, but the cheerful atmosphere had completely disappeared. Street vendors stopped calling out to potential customers. Tour guides paused their historical explanations. Even the pigeons that normally gathered around the palace seemed to sense the tension and flew away to find quieter areas. Marcus' voice grew louder and more demanding. He wanted James to acknowledge him, to respond to his questions, to show some sign that he was listening. But the guard remained as still and silent as a statue carved from stone. The peaceful morning atmosphere around Buckingham Palace began to change when Marcus Thompson pushed his way through the crowd of tourists. He was a man who stood out immediately. At 35 years old, Marcus had the look of someone who carried anger with him everywhere he went. His clothes were wrinkled, and his hair was messy, as if he had not slept well in days. In his hands, Marcus gripped a large wooden flagpole that was almost as tall as he was. The pole was thick and heavy, made from solid wood that had been painted white, but was now chipped and worn from use. Attached to the top was a banner with bold black letters demanding political changes. The fabric flapped in the morning breeze as Marcus moved through the crowd like a man on a mission. The tourists around him began to notice that something was different about this man. While everyone else was smiling and taking pictures, Marcus wore a deep frown on his face. His eyes were dark and intense, filled with frustration that seemed to build with each step he took. Some families instinctively moved their children closer to them when they saw him approaching. Marcus had been an activist for many years. He believed strongly in his political causes and had spent countless hours at protests and demonstrations. But recently his anger had grown beyond normal levels. He felt ignored by the government and frustrated that his message was not being heard. Today, that frustration had reached a breaking point that made him dangerous. As he moved closer to where Guardsman James Mitchell stood at attention, Marcus began to mutter under his breath. His words were angry and bitter, directed at the government, the royal family, and anyone in uniform. The flagpole in his hands began to sway more dramatically as his emotions took control of his movements. The other tourists started to back away from Marcus, creating a small circle of space around him. An elderly woman from Germany whispered to her husband in their native language, clearly concerned about what might happen next. A family with young children quietly moved to a different viewing spot further from where Marcus was heading. Marcus did not care about the uncomfortable looks he was receiving from the crowd. His focus was entirely on the red uniformed guard, who stood so perfectly still ahead of him. To Marcus, the guard represented everything he hated about the system he was fighting against. Here was a symbol of authority, standing there looking so calm and untouchable, while ordinary people like himself struggled to be heard. The flagpole grew heavier in his hands, but Marcus clutched it tighter. The wood was rough against his palms, and he could feel splinters trying to work their way into his skin. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional fire burning inside his chest. His heart was racing, and his breathing had become quick and shallow. Street performers who had been entertaining the crowd began to pack up their equipment, sensing that the mood was changing. Even they could tell that something was about to happen that would not be pleasant to watch. The cheerful music that had been playing from a nearby radio seemed to fade into the background as tension filled the air. Security cameras mounted on poles around the palace area automatically adjusted their angles to focus on Marcus. In control rooms, trained operators watched his every movement, noting his aggressive behavior and the weapon-like object in his hands. Radio communications crackled as security personnel were quietly alerted to the developing situation. Marcus was now just 20 feet away from James Mitchell. The guard remained perfectly still, completely unaware of the approaching threat. His training had taught him to ignore distractions, but this was about to become much more than a simple distraction. The morning sun continued to shine brightly, but the shadow of conflict was falling across what had started as such a beautiful and peaceful day. The crowd grew quieter as people sensed the building tension. Conversations stopped and camera phones began to point in Marcus' direction. No one knew exactly what was about to happen, but everyone could feel that the pleasant tourist experience they had come to enjoy was about to take a very dark turn. The morning sun painted the sky in soft shades of gold and pink as London slowly came to life. The streets around Buckingham Palace were already bustling with activity, even though it was only 8 in the morning. Tour buses lined up along the roads, dropping off excited visitors from all corners of the world. Children pressed their faces against the windows, pointing at the magnificent palace gates while their parents checked cameras and adjusted backpacks. Among the growing crowd stood families who had traveled thousands of miles just for this moment. An elderly couple from Japan held hands as they approached the famous black and gold gates. They had been planning this trip for over a year, and today was the highlight of their London adventure. Their faces glowed with anticipation as they found a good spot near the front of the gathering crowd. Behind them, a young mother from Australia lifted her 5-year-old daughter onto her shoulders so the little girl could see over the heads of the adults. The child giggled with excitement, clutching the small British flag. she had bought from a street vendor. Her eyes were wide with wonder as she looked at the grand palace before her. Standing perfectly still at his post was Guardsman James Mitchell. At 24 years old, he had already spent 3 years serving as one of the elite royal guards. His uniform was absolutely perfect. The bright red tunic fit his tall frame without a single wrinkle. Every button gleamed in the morning sunlight as if it had been polished just moments before. His black bearskin hat stood tall and proud, adding nearly a foot to his already impressive height. James held his rifle with practiced ease. The weapon was positioned exactly as regulations demanded. His white gloves gripped the rifle with steady hands that had performed the same duty hundreds of times before. His black boots were so shiny they reflected the faces of the tourists who gathered around him trying to get the perfect photograph. What made James truly remarkable was his complete stillness. He stood like a statue carved from stone. His eyes stared straight ahead, fixed on an invisible point in the distance. Not a muscle in his face moved. He did not blink when camera flashes went off inches from his face. He showed no reaction when tourists waved their hands trying to get his attention. The crowd found his stillness both fascinating and amusing. Some visitors tried to make him smile by telling jokes or making funny faces. Others attempted to startle him with sudden movements or loud noises. Children giggled as they walked around him in circles trying to catch his eye. But James remained unmoved, like a guardian statue protecting the palace behind him. This was not his first time dealing with curious tourists. Over his 3 years of service, James had seen it all. People had tried every trick imaginable to get a reaction from him. Some had spoken to him in different languages. Others had told him dramatic stories or asked him personal questions. A few had even tried to touch his uniform or rifle. But James had been trained for all of this. The training of a royal guard was intense and thorough. For months, James had practiced standing perfectly still for hours at a time. He had learned to ignore distractions, heat, cold, rain, and even physical discomfort. His instructors had taught him that being a royal guard meant more than just wearing a fancy uniform. It was a symbol of British tradition and military excellence. The palace behind James rose majestically against the clear blue sky. Its windows caught the morning light, creating a dazzling display that made tourists reach for their cameras. The famous balcony where the royal family appeared for special occasions looked down on the scene. Guards like James had been protecting this historic building for centuries, carrying on a tradition that connected the present to a grand and storied past. As the morning progressed, more people arrived. The crowd grew larger and more energetic. Tour guides spoke in multiple languages, explaining the history of the guards and the significance of the ceremony that would soon begin. Street performers entertained waiting visitors with music and magic tricks. Vendors sold postcards, miniature guards, and British flags to eager tourists. James remained focused on his duty, completely unaware that this peaceful Tuesday morning would soon be shattered by an incident that would test every aspect of his training and change his life forever. The frustrated anger in Marcus Thompson's eyes had now turned into something much more dangerous. His face was no longer just red, but had taken on a deep purple color that showed he was beyond the point of rational thinking. Veins bulged on his forehead and neck as his blood pressure soared from the rage building inside him. The complete silence from Guardsman James Mitchell had pushed Marcus past his breaking point. Marcus stopped circling around the guard and planted himself directly in front of James once again. This time he stood so close that their chests were almost touching. The flagpole in his hands trembled not from nervousness, but from the pure anger coursing through his body. His breathing had become so heavy and fast that it sounded like he had just finished running a marathon. The tourists who remained nearby could feel the change in Marcus' behavior. What had started as angry shouting was now transforming into something that felt truly threatening. A family from France quickly gathered their children and moved toward the palace gates. An elderly British couple who had come to enjoy a traditional ceremony found themselves backing away step by step while keeping their eyes on the unfolding drama. Marcus raised the flagpole higher than before. The heavy wooden pole now hovered dangerously close to James' head. The banner attached to it cast shadows across both men as Marcus began making more aggressive movements. He poked the air just inches from the guard's face, testing how close he could get without actually making contact. Still, James did not move. His eyes remained focused on that distant point beyond the crowd. His breathing stayed calm and measured even as Marcus became more threatening. The guard's training was being tested to its absolute limits, but he held firm to everything he had been taught about discipline and self-control. Security officers who had been quietly moving closer now began speaking into their radios with more urgency. They could see that the situation was rapidly becoming dangerous, but they also knew they had to be careful. Moving in too quickly might cause Marcus to panic and do something even more reckless. They needed to time their intervention perfectly. Marcus began poking James' chest with the end of the flagpole. Each jab left a small mark on the pristine red fabric of the guard's uniform. The first poke was light, almost like a tap to get attention, but each following poke became harder and more aggressive. Marcus was using the flagpole like a weapon, trying to provoke some kind of reaction from the motionless guard. The crowd gasped each time the pole made contact with James' uniform. Some people covered their children's eyes, not wanting them to see what might happen next. Others held their phones ready to record whatever was about to unfold, though many were too shocked to remember to actually start filming. Sweat was now pouring down Marcus' face despite the cool morning air. His shirt was beginning to stick to his back, and his hands were becoming slippery on the wooden flagpole. But his grip only tightened as his anger reached new heights. The wooden pole creaked under the pressure of his clenched fists. James could feel each poke against his chest, but his face showed no signs of pain or annoyance. His military training had prepared him for physical discomfort, and he had learned to mentally separate himself from what was happening to his body. However, even his extensive training could not have fully prepared him for what Marcus was planning to do next. The morning that had started so peacefully was now balanced on a knife edge. The beautiful ceremony that tourists had come to see was about to be shattered by an act of violence that would change everything. Marcus raised the flagpole one more time, but now his intentions were clearly different from before. The wooden pole felt heavier in his hands as he prepared to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Around them, the crowd held its breath, sensing that the moment of truth had finally arrived. What happened next would determine whether this would end as just another crazy tourist story or something much more serious. Marcus Thompson's control finally snapped completely. With a roar of pure rage, he swung the heavy wooden flagpole with all his strength directly at guardsman James Mitchell's head. The pole whistled through the air like a deadly weapon aimed to cause serious harm. The crowd screamed in horror as they watched what looked like an attack that could kill or badly injure the motionless guard. For one terrible moment, time seemed to freeze. The flagpole moved through the air in what felt like slow motion, while James remained perfectly still, seeming completely unaware of the danger heading toward him. Tourists covered their eyes, unable to watch what they thought would be a brutal assault. Children cried as their parents pulled them away from the terrifying scene. But James Mitchell was not the helpless target that Marcus thought he was attacking. Under that ceremonial red uniform was a highly trained soldier who had spent years learning combat techniques and self-defense. The Royal Guards were not just pretty decorations for tourists to photograph. They were active military personnel capable of defending themselves and others when necessary. In the split second before the flagpole would have connected with his head, James moved with lightning speed that shocked everyone watching. His military training kicked in automatically as his body reacted to the threat without conscious thought. Years of practice and discipline had prepared him for exactly this moment, even though he had hoped it would never come. James ducked down low, avoiding the swinging flagpole by mere inches. At the same time, he stepped forward and to the side, using Marcus' own forward momentum against him. The guard's movements were so smooth and quick that many people in the crowd missed exactly what happened. One moment Marcus was attacking, and the next moment everything had changed. As the flagpole swung over his head, James reached out and grabbed Marcus' wrist with both hands. His grip was strong and sure from years of handling military equipment and weapons. Marcus suddenly found his weapon arm locked in place, unable to continue his attack. The surprise on his face was clear as he realized the guard was not as helpless as he had appeared. Using techniques learned in military combat training, James twisted Marcus' arm, while simultaneously sweeping the protester's legs out from under him. The move was performed with perfect timing and precision. Marcus, who had been so confident and aggressive just seconds before, now found himself completely off balance and unable to control what was happening to his body. The flagpole flew from Marcus' hands as he lost his grip during the takedown. It soared through the air, harmlessly landing several feet away with a loud clatter on the stone pavement. The banner that had been attached to it fluttered to the ground like a defeated flag. The weapon that Marcus had wielded so threateningly was now just a piece of wood lying uselessly on the ground. Marcus himself followed the flagpole toward the ground, but much less gracefully. His feet left the pavement as James completed the takedown move. For a moment, the protester was airborne, his arms windmilling as he tried to catch his balance. His face showed complete shock and confusion as he realized he was falling. The impact when Marcus hit the stone pavement was hard and loud. He landed flat on his back with his arms and legs spread out like a star. The breath was knocked completely out of his lungs, and he lay there gasping like a fish out of water. His eyes were wide with surprise, and his mouth opened and closed as he struggled to understand what had just happened to him. The entire sequence, from the initial attack to Marcus lying on the ground, had taken less than 3 seconds. Most of the tourists who were watching had barely had time to process what they were seeing. One moment there was a dangerous attack happening, and the next moment the attacker was on the ground looking completely defeated. What happened next impressed the watching crowd even more than James Mitchell's incredible defensive skills. As Marcus Thompson lay on the ground struggling to breathe and understand what had happened to him, James did something that showed his true character and professional training. Instead of standing over his defeated attacker or showing any sign of victory, James immediately returned to his ceremonial post. With the same calm precision he had shown throughout the entire incident, James stepped back to his exact position. He picked up his rifle, which had remained perfectly in place during the brief struggle, and resumed his formal stance. His face showed no emotion, no satisfaction from defeating his attacker, and no anger about being attacked in the first place. He simply returned to being a statue-like guard, as if nothing unusual had happened. The crowd watched in amazement as James stared straight ahead, once again focusing on that invisible point in the distance. His breathing was calm and steady, showing no signs that he had just been in a physical confrontation. His uniform, though slightly wrinkled from the movement, still looked remarkably neat and proper. Even the tall black bearskin hat remained perfectly positioned on his head. This display of discipline and self-control left the tourists speechless. They had just witnessed an attack that could have seriously injured or killed the guard, followed by a masterful defensive response. But instead of celebrating or showing off, James had simply returned to his duty, as if protecting himself was just another part of his job. Meanwhile, Marcus remained on the stone pavement trying to get his breath back. His face was red, not just from anger now, but from the shock of hitting the ground so hard. He rolled onto his side, and then slowly tried to push himself up with his hands. His movements were shaky and uncertain as his body recovered from the impact, and his mind tried to process the embarrassing defeat he had just experienced. As Marcus struggled to stand up, he looked toward James with confusion and something that might have been respect. The guard he had thought was just a decorative figure had proven to be a highly skilled warrior. The man he had tried to humiliate and attack had instead taught him a lesson about the difference between real strength and angry bluster. The tourists who had witnessed the entire incident began to react in different ways. Some started clapping their hands in appreciation of James' professional handling of the situation. Others remained silent, still shocked by how quickly everything had happened. A few people began talking excitedly to their companions, describing what they had just seen. Many visitors pulled out their phones and started taking pictures or videos of James as he stood at his post. They wanted to capture the image of this remarkable guard who had shown such incredible skill and restraint. Social media posts were already being written in people's minds as they realized they had witnessed something truly extraordinary. Parents used the incident as a teaching moment for their children. They explained how James had only used enough force to stop the attack and had not tried to hurt Marcus more than necessary. They talked about how real heroes protect themselves and others without seeking revenge or showing off their power. The contrast between the two men was striking and obvious to everyone watching. Marcus had been loud, aggressive, and ultimately ineffective. His anger had made him careless, and his attack had failed completely. James, on the other hand, had been quiet, controlled, and devastatingly effective when he needed to be. His calm discipline had allowed him to respond perfectly to a dangerous situation. Street vendors who had paused their work to watch the drama now returned to calling out to potential customers. The normal sounds of the tourist area began to return, though everyone was still talking about what they had just witnessed. Tour guides would have a new story to tell future visitors about the day a protester learned not to underestimate a royal guard. Marcus finally managed to get to his feet, though he remained unsteady and confused. He looked around at all the people watching him and seemed to realize for the first time how foolish his actions had been. The reality of what he had done and what could happen to him next was beginning to sink into his still shocked mind. The sound of heavy footsteps on stone pavement announced the arrival of palace security officers and metropolitan police. They had been monitoring the situation from various positions around the tourist area and had moved in quickly once the physical confrontation began. Their response time was impressive, showing just how well coordinated the security systems around Buckingham Palace were. The first officer to reach the scene was a tall, stern-looking man in his 40s who had clearly seen many unusual situations during his years of service. He surveyed the scene quickly, taking in Marcus still unsteady on his feet, the flagpole lying abandoned on the ground, and James Mitchell standing perfectly at attention, as if nothing had happened. Behind him came two more security officers and a female police constable who immediately began speaking into her radio to report the situation to her supervisors. Within minutes, more officers arrived, creating a small crowd of uniformed personnel around the incident site. Their presence brought a sense of order and safety back to the area. The security officers had witnessed most of what happened through the extensive camera system that monitored every inch of the palace grounds. They had seen Marcus' aggressive approach, his threatening behavior with the flagpole, and the actual attack on James. They had also seen the guard's professional response and his immediate return to duty afterward. One of the officers approached Marcus, who was now standing but still looking dazed and confused. The officer spoke to him in a calm but firm voice, explaining that he was under arrest for assaulting a member of the military and for disturbing the peace. Marcus did not resist as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. He seemed to be in shock about how quickly his day had gone from angry protest to criminal arrest. As the reality of his situation began to sink in, Marcus' face changed from confusion to genuine fear. He realized that attacking a royal guard was a serious crime that could result in years in prison. The anger that had driven him to this moment was now replaced by regret and worry about what would happen to him next. The police constable began reading Marcus his rights while other officers spoke with witnesses in the crowd. Many tourists eagerly offered to share what they had seen, and several people had recorded parts of the incident on their phones. The officers collected contact information from key witnesses who might be needed to testify later. James Mitchell continued to stand at his post throughout all of this activity. Even as officers moved around him and tourists pointed in his direction, he maintained his ceremonial stance. His commanding officers would later commend him not just for defending himself effectively, but for returning immediately to his duties without seeking attention or praise. The abandoned flagpole was collected as evidence along with the banner that had been attached to it. These items would be important in proving that Marcus had been carrying what could be considered a weapon when he made his attack. The wooden pole was heavy enough to cause serious injury or even death if it had connected with James' head as intended. News crews began arriving at the scene, having been alerted by social media posts and police radio chatter. Reporters set up their cameras and began interviewing witnesses, while cameramen captured footage of the aftermath. The incident was already spreading across social media platforms, where videos taken by tourists were being shared thousands of times. Marcus was led away to a police vehicle that had been called to transport him to the station for processing. His head was down and his shoulders slumped as he walked between two officers. The confident, angry man who had arrived at the palace just an hour earlier was now a defeated figure facing serious legal consequences for his actions. The tourists who had witnessed everything began to disperse, though many remained in the area hoping to get a better look at James or to hear more details about what had happened. The incident had turned their pleasant sightseeing trip into an unforgettable experience that they would talk about for years to come. Parents explained to their children why the man had been arrested and why it was important to respect soldiers and police officers who were doing their jobs. The incident became a real-life lesson about consequences and the importance of controlling anger and frustration in healthy ways rather than turning to violence. Within hours of the incident, videos of the confrontation between Marcus Thompson and Guardsman James Mitchell were spreading across the internet like wildfire. The footage captured by tourists on their smartphones showed the entire sequence from Marcus' angry approach to his dramatic takedown and defeat. Social media platforms were flooded with shares, comments, and reactions from people around the world. The videos went viral almost immediately. On Twitter, the hashtag Royal Guard Takedown became trending within 2 hours of the first video being posted. Facebook users shared the footage with captions praising James' professional response and condemning Marcus' aggressive behavior. YouTube videos with titles like "Angry Protester Gets Instant Justice" and "Royal Guard Shows Amazing Skills" were gaining millions of views. News organizations around the globe picked up the story and began broadcasting it on their evening programs. Major networks in the United States, Australia, Germany, and Japan all featured the incident as a top story. International news websites posted articles with dramatic headlines about the protester who learned not to mess with British Royal Guards. The London Police Department held a press conference to address the incident and provide official details about what had happened. A senior officer explained that Marcus Thompson had been charged with assault on a military officer, disturbing the peace, and carrying an offensive weapon. The charges were serious and could result in several years in prison if he was found guilty. During the press conference, the police spokesman praised James Mitchell for his restraint and professionalism. He explained that the guard had used only the minimum force necessary to defend himself and had immediately returned to his duties without seeking recognition or revenge. The incident was being used as an example of proper police and military training in action. James Mitchell himself became an overnight celebrity, though he continued to serve his regular duties without seeking attention. His commanding officers received hundreds of letters and emails from people around the world praising his actions. Many writers expressed admiration for his calm discipline under pressure and his immediate return to duty after defending himself. The British military released a statement commending James for upholding the highest standards of the Royal Guards. They emphasize that all guards receive extensive training in self-defense and crowd control, but that incidents requiring such skills were extremely rare. James was recommended for a commendation recognizing his exemplary service. Marcus Thompson, meanwhile, was released on bail pending his court appearance. He had spent the night in a police cell, which gave him time to think about his actions and their consequences. When he emerged from the police station the next morning, he was met by reporters who wanted to interview him about the incident. Looking tired and defeated, Marcus spoke briefly to the media, expressing regret for his actions. He admitted that his anger had gotten the better of him and that he had made a terrible mistake. He apologized to James Mitchell, the Royal Guards, and the tourists whose day he had ruined with his behavior. His lawyer advised him to say nothing more until his court case. Legal experts who commented on the case explained that Marcus faced serious charges that could result in up to 5 years in prison. Attacking a member of the military while they were on duty was considered a particularly serious offense. The fact that the incident had been captured on video and witnessed by dozens of people made it very likely that he would be convicted. The incident sparked discussions about protest rights and appropriate behavior around military and police personnel. While many people supported the right to peaceful protest, they condemned Marcus' violent approach and praised James' restrained response. Social media was filled with debates about where the line should be drawn between free speech and threatening behavior. Tour companies operating around Buckingham Palace reported increased interest in their services as people hoped to see the famous guard who had become a viral sensation. Some visitors specifically asked to be shown the exact spot where the incident had occurred. James Mitchell had unknowingly become a tourist attraction himself. The Royal Guards as a whole received more positive attention than they had in years. People who had never thought much about the men and women who stood guard at British palaces and royal residences gained new appreciation for their training and dedication. The incident had reminded everyone that these guards were not just ceremonial figures but highly trained soldiers. 6 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, the story of Guardsman James Mitchell and protester Marcus Thompson had become one of the most famous confrontations ever captured on video. The footage continued to be shared across social media platforms and had been viewed over 100 million times worldwide. James had become a symbol of professional discipline and military excellence that inspired people far beyond Britain. James Mitchell returned to his normal duties as a royal guard, but his life had changed in ways he never expected. He received thousands of letters from people around the world thanking him for his service and praising his handling of the dangerous situation. Military personnel from other countries wrote to express their respect for his restraint and professionalism under pressure. The British government recognized James' contributions with a formal commendation for exceptional service. In a ceremony attended by senior military officials and members of the royal family, James was presented with a medal acknowledging his exemplary conduct. He remained humble throughout the ceremony, saying he had simply done his job as he was trained to do. James' story became part of the training curriculum for new royal guards. Video of the incident was shown to recruits as an example of how to handle aggressive confrontations while maintaining military discipline. Instructors used the footage to demonstrate the importance of staying calm under pressure and using only necessary force when defending oneself. The incident also led to improved security measures around royal properties. Additional officers were stationed in civilian clothes among tourist crowds to identify potential threats earlier. New camera systems were installed to provide better coverage of all areas where guards were posted. The goal was to prevent similar incidents before they could escalate to violence. Marcus Thompson served his full 3-year prison sentence, during which time he participated in anger management programs and received counseling for his mental health issues. When he was released, he spoke publicly about how the incident had changed his life. He expressed deep regret for his actions and gratitude that James had not been seriously injured. Upon his release, Marcus began working with organizations that helped people manage anger and frustration in healthy ways. He shared his story as a cautionary tale about how quickly anger can lead to actions that destroy lives. His experience became part of community programs aimed at preventing violence and promoting peaceful conflict resolution. The tourist area around Buckingham Palace returned to its normal peaceful atmosphere, though the incident was not forgotten. Tour guides routinely told visitors about the day a protester learned not to underestimate a royal guard. The story became part of the folklore surrounding the famous palace and its dedicated protectors. James Mitchell continued his military career and was eventually promoted to a senior position within the Royal Guards. He used his experience and newfound fame to advocate for better training and support for military personnel dealing with public confrontations. His insights helped improve protocols for handling similar situations in the future. The incident sparked academic studies about crowd behavior, protest dynamics, and the psychology of confrontation. Universities used the footage in courses on conflict resolution, security studies, and military psychology. The case became a textbook example of how proper training and discipline could prevent a dangerous situation from becoming a tragedy. Years later, both men had moved on with their lives, but the incident continued to resonate with people around the world. James Mitchell had proven that true strength came not from aggression, but from discipline, restraint, and professional excellence. Marcus Thompson had learned that anger without control leads only to destruction and regret. The lesson of that Tuesday morning at Buckingham Palace remained clear for anyone who watched the viral video. Violence against those serving in uniform would not be tolerated, and those who chose such actions would face serious consequences. At the same time, the incident showed that even in the face of attack, trained professionals could respond with exactly the right amount of force needed to protect themselves and others. The story became a lasting reminder that behind the ceremonial uniforms and tourist attractions stood real people with real skills doing a real job. The royal guards were not just ornamental figures for photographs, but dedicated soldiers ready to protect Britain and its institutions. James Mitchell had shown the world what that dedication looked like when put to the ultimate test.